So today's talk is on modernism. So it's a continuation of the last talk, not just modernism, but a group within the church known as the New Theology, which is really just a sneaky way of bringing back the same old heresy of modernism. Okay, so for those who weren't here, what is modernism? Modernism could be summarized as the idea that truth changes with time, or more specifically, the dogmas of the faith evolved. We had these old teachings in the medieval ages, but now society is different. We have new times and new struggles. So now God changes, and things like birth control and contraception, we have new understandings of those teachings, eugenics, things like that. The laws of those can be changed. The church adapts to society. It is God that adapts to man rather than man conforming himself to God. And really, ultimately, this is a great heresy, because every time we sin, we are looking at God's law and we're saying, that's what God wants to do. This is what I want to do, right? And that's what the heresy of modernism says. But the difference is, it says, it's not just that I want to do it, it says God's going to conform to my lifestyle and my society and the way that I want to live. Okay, and the big part, so we talked before about what exactly makes the modernist, where he gets his doctrines from. And it ultimately comes from a new philosophy. So in the past, you have what's called Thomistic philosophy, based off of realism, or even just general scholastic philosophy. What you see is really there. We look at the tree, we comprehend the tree. We comprehend gold. We comprehend all these material things outside of us. I look at the human being, and I can comprehend humanity. But with the modern philosophies of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, our ability to know anything is doubted. Though Kant accepted that there might be a material world or some sort of world outside of us, we can't really know it. And here's a big distinction. So he has two words, noumena and phenomena. So in Kant, remember, you're a living thing, you're a thinking thing. You kind of live in some sort of world. There's stuff outside of you, and you have some sort of knowledge of that stuff outside of you, but is your knowledge really accurate? So we sense the tree, and I sense colors, I sense a size, I sense a shape. But according to Kant, yes, we have those sense information about it, but does that really reflect what the tree is really like? Aristotle, Thomistic realism, we sense the tree, we understand it because the tree is actually there. It exists the way we sense it. At times, yes, our senses can be damaged and we don't sense things correctly, but that's not the norm. When our senses are, when we're healthy and our senses are working properly, what we sense is really there. And there's times we can be deceived, such as a stick in the water, but through our senses, we can understand that that stick in the water that appears bent is not actually bent, right? Through our senses, we can know the truth. All right, so we see Thomistic realism and the Kantian doubt. And Kant, he has what's called the noumena and the phenomena. This is important. We'll be going back to this. The noumena is this chaotic stuff outside of us. We can't know the noumena. All he has is the phenomena, what we experience. Though our experience comes from things outside of us, we're not actually experiencing these things. We're just experiencing these things we kind of make up in our minds and our intellects, okay? Kind of like in the Matrix, a computer reading code, right? You read this code and you have all these images on the screen, right? That's how Kant sees us. We're looking at this chaotic world, and our brain interprets it with colors and shape and all sorts of characteristics. So, and as we said before, because Kant doesn't believe that we can know things, we can't know nature, and there's no natural law. When I look at the tree, I understand its characteristics. I understand the nature of the tree, the nature of gold, the nature of copper. These natures actually exist in things outside of us. I comprehend treeness or goldness or copperness or humanity. With Kant, he can't do that anymore. He rejects our ability to actually know this. And this has a direct reflect on how your morality is created. When you understand the nature of something, you can see man was created to be a certain way. By virtue of saying man's nature was created a certain way, you're saying God created a man to be a certain way. So we can see the digestive system. The purpose of this is created to nourish the body, right? When we act against the digestive system's purpose, when we eat too much food, we're damaging ourselves, right? We're acting against the natural law, right? When we look at various other faculties that we have, speech, what is the purpose of the intellect? To know truth. What is the perfect purpose of speech? Is to convey truth. When we say things that are false, when we lie, we act against the very purpose that our intellect was created to do. Without even looking at divine revelation, we can look at man's nature and see that certain things are contrary to the will of God because of the way God created man. So because of this very reason, modern philosophers have to turn to a whole new realm in order to devise their morality. And this morality will be the foundation for the new theology. There's actually something they have called the new natural law, which really isn't about nature, but it's their attempt to know moral issues through reason alone. Okay, so as I said before, the answer to the modernist heresy was Thomistic philosophy. And the new theology, the answer to that is Thomistic theology. For the most part, the people, the new theology, don't like Thomism. Now, there's different degrees of the new theology. We have to remember different times in the church you have new ideas, and everyone thinks they're great. Even Venerable Fulton Sheen had a little bit where he promoted some of these ideas. Remember, there are the extreme new theology people, and then there are the more moderate, trying to dabble with these ideas, trying to maybe take modern philosophy and incorporate it into the church. I think some of these more moderates maybe isn't so bad to read, but I think as a whole, this movement damaged the church because when you base your morality on a philosophy where you can't really know natures, you don't have a strong reason for believing in those things. They become relatively weak. We'll go more into that later.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes.
Two questions. When was Immanuel Kant's heyday? When did he write Critique of Pure Reason? What year?
Oh, I believe 1800s. I don't know the exact year for that.
And you're saying that he was the beginning of new theology, Immanuel Kant?
Well, he was not a Catholic. But what happened is Catholics eventually, his thought began to influence the modern Catholic sphere. And the ideology slowly began to seep in. And I would say the theology that was formed from this philosophy is partly what is the new theology.
It was called the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung in German. From
Okay.
1770 thereabouts, leading up to 1789, the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of way before the new theology. The new theology, I'd say it really started in like the 1930s is kind of when this movement is beginning.
French, right?
Yes. So as we're going to talk about now, Father Garrigou-Lagrange was a famous Thomistic theologian who did a lot to counter this movement. Supposedly the document Humani Generis, written by Pope Pius XII, he was supposedly the ghostwriter for this document that condemns certain characteristics of the new theology. Anyway, so this Father Garrigou-Lagrange, he taught at the Angelicum, which was one of the great Thomistic schools in Rome. He was a great theologian, and he was a traditionalist. And we have to remember, this was before there was a traditionalist movement in the proper sense that we think of today, or the Latin Mass. And I think this is something we really have to be aware of as traditional Catholics. Sometimes people as traditional Catholics are like, oh, the liturgy, I go to the Latin Mass, now I'm traditional. But the Latin Mass is one little aspect. Actually, we shouldn't go directly to Latin Mass because we're traditional, what we should first be doing is, okay, we understand the theology and the Latin Mass, which more properly reflects a more healthy spiritual life and more specifically counteracts certain heresies, is better for our soul in various ways. So I don't want to say the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, is bad in of itself, but when we look at various measures that were put in the traditional liturgy, there were things in there to fight against certain heresies. So without ever being taught, certain things were heresies. The very structure of the liturgy fought against it and a correct understanding of spirituality and theology. Though the new Mass may not explicitly recommend or promote any heresies, it does not do a good of a job of counteracting them. Here's one example. When the Protestants, some of the Cranmer, wanted to reflect his new understanding of the liturgy, the Mass was not a sacrifice, the unbloody sacrifice at Calvary, where Jesus Christ is offered on the cross to the Father. No, he believed the Mass was a meal. So what did he do? He turned the altar around. He faced the people. Why? Because this wasn't an altar anymore. This was merely a table. So in the traditional Latin Mass, you can't face the people. You have to face what's called ad orientem, or away from the people. Now, in the Novus Ordo, they allow the Mass to be done either way. The Novus Ordo can be done with the priest and the lay people all facing the same direction, but there was permission, allowance for the priest to face the people. Now, Pope Benedict, to try to counteract this idea that the Mass is a meal, he would put the crucifix on the front of the altar and the 6 candles there. So even though he might be facing the people, he's looking at the crucifix while he's saying the Mass to try to counteract this idea that the Mass is a meal. But aside from that, the average Novus Ordo you go to, it has a lot of the characteristics and looks more like a meal than does a sacrifice. I myself can remember when I was first reading about the Trinity Mass and reading about the Mass being a sacrifice. I was like, well, okay, I guess that's true. Then I went to my first Trinity Mass and I saw the altar, and it looked like an altar. It looked like you could put a lamb up there and sacrifice it, and the vestments and the whole decorum of the Mass. It better reflected the theology of what was going on. So, as we're going to say later on, so I went a little out of order, but I guess a problem with what we'll see with some of these more conservative movements of the new theology is that because they don't have a good philosophy, they kind of tend to lack precision. Even though they may not be heretics in the proper sense, they will tend to overemphasize things that are less important, such as emphasizing, well, the Mass is a sacrifice, but the communal aspect is so important and so wonderful. I mean, there is a communal aspect of the Mass that is good and proper, but we cannot put that on the same level as the unbloody sacrifice at Calvary. One is categorically far superior to the other. All right, so Father Garrigou-Lagrange, back to him. He is famous for quoting the term, the Nouvelle théologie, or the new theology. And he said, where is this new theology leading us? It is leading us back to modernism. And eventually, St. Pius X would, after he condemned modernism in his encyclical, he actually published what was called the 32 Thomistic Theses. And these were 32 philosophical statements that all seminaries had to conform to. And they were precise statements about, based off of Thomism, about metaphysics, philosophy of nature, and philosophy of man. And for the average person, if you were to read these, they'd probably sound, they don't sound like that big of a deal. But if you're basing your philosophy off of this, and then you do your theology afterwards, a mistake here causes a really big problem. It's literally the same process as an engineer who has some problems in his math, then goes to build a bridge. Even though his science of engineering might be really good, if he's making fundamental mistakes in that math that doesn't look like a big deal to others, once he constructs the bridge, it's going to have major problems. I'm going to say this is part of the problem with some of the more radical movements of the New Theology. Okay, as we said before, in the New Theology, you do John Paul II and Pope Benedict were actually the more moderate members of this. There was a journal called Communio, and part of the New Theology got really radical and crazy. So Communio was the people who actually cared about the faith, but they wanted to take some of these thinking, some of these ideas of the New Theology and incorporate it in a more moderate way. And not all of their stuff is necessarily bad to read, but it depends. As a whole, I think it's ideal to avoid some of these things. So John Paul II was actually taught by Father Garrigou-Lagrange in his formation. But at one point, Father Garrigou-Lagrange said about John Paul II, writes a lot, says very little, and he refused to give him his doctorate. John Paul II ended up getting his doctorate somewhere else at another university in Poland. Anyway, so, but it would be false to say that John Paul II was not heavily influenced by Father Garrigou-Lagrange. It's actually believed that his encyclical Fides et Ratio was a testament, faith and reason, to what John Paul II learned from his many years with Father Garrigou-Lagrange. So one thing that John Paul II was really into was a movement called phenomenology. And this is important. This was what John Paul II was starting to dabble with. Some people would say he wasn't a true phenomenologist, but let's explain John Paul II through this. If you're in a world where a lot of people are now consumed with modern philosophy, it seems what John Paul II at times is trying to do, he's acknowledging people are consumed with modern philosophy, so we're going to take this and we're going to do the best we can do with modern philosophy to affirm the traditional teaching. So the theology of the body of John Paul II relies on some of the arguments from Kant, some of that philosophy, but it is an attempt at John Paul II to use the philosophy of Kant combined with theology to defend the church's teaching on contraception. Is this a bad thing? No, it's not. But I've read all of the theology of the body. I've had talks with people, and I think there's a consensus that I think theology of the body is the best you can do for defending contraception without Thomistic philosophy. But are the arguments as solid? Not quite, because with Thomistic philosophy, they're very simple. We can look at it and say, boom, contraception is contrary to the will of God. Theology of the body relies on not how God views man, but based on how men view each other, what is the best way for men to interact with each other. And it seems like the best way for men to interact is to not use contraception. So this isn't a bad argument, but one absolutely proves contraception is contrary to God's law. I would argue theology of the body, and some people might disagree, but from what I've seen when talking to other people, it shows that this is contraception, not using contraception, is the best way to have like a happy marriage. But I don't know it actually proves that it is a sin to use contraception. Okay? I think a problem now is when the foundation for sexual ethics is based on theology of the body. You're not getting to the root of the questions. So I can remember, well, we'll get back to this. Yes.
I just want to backtrack a bit here. You saying John Paul II kind of fused together Thomism and phenomenology.
Yeah, he did have some Thomism. He was more into the phenomenology. It was, I would say, theology of the body is more phenomenology, more modern philosophy. But in his life, he did have some Thomism in some of his other works.
So then my question for you is this, what we call the Hegelian dialectic. If Thomism is the thesis and new theology is the antithesis, John Paul and Benedict XVI attempted a synthesis between Thomism and new theology.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, they're trying to take. You could say they're trying to take from the new theology what you can and baptize it, so people who are already in that thinking have a clearer mind and having to relearn everything. Does that make sense?
No, I understand it totally. That came out of the Kant era. Hegel and Kant were contemporaries.
Very good. Okay, so back to phenomenology. What is phenomenology? So we talked about there is the phenomena and the noumena of Kant. The noumena is that craziness outside of us we can't know, okay? The phenomena is what we come to sense, what we come to understand. So there's a whole branch of philosophy called phenomenology. And phenomenology just studies the phenomena. But here's the thing. So Thomism is kind of a phenomenology too, but the difference with Thomism is that we study the phenomena in order to understand essences and natures of things, right? Man can't just peer to the essence of a tree. He has to sense the tree. Then after sensing the tree, after sensing the snow, after sensing the gold, he can begin to understand the thing he senses. But phenomenology just studies the sensation in and of itself without necessarily acknowledging that it's intimately connected to the nature. This is called phenomenology. And this is, what is the purpose of phenomenology? You kind of have the modern philosophers who are just kind of out into nowhere. They've kind of left reality. And people are like, well, we have to come back to reality. So what do people do? They're trying to, through phenomenology, come back to reality, come back to realism. But they still haven't fully acknowledged that we can know the natures of things. So it's a bit inadequate. And I would say phenomenology, remember, just focus on kind of the phenomenologists. When they're looking at theology, they're not looking at the thing of itself, but the experience, the encounter. Experience and encounter are two things phenomenologists love to talk about. But unfortunately, though experience encounters are real things, they are in a sense important. They're never the most important aspect of something. So let's take an example. I once talked to a nun who was part of a more conservative movement, right? But they were in a conservative movement that was heavily trained in phenomenology. And she was telling me about the new stethoscope, how the new stethoscope was terrible. Why was the new stethoscope terrible? Because it was electronic, and the doctor didn't have this encounter with the patient. And the whole purpose of a doctor is his encounter with the patient that they're taking care of. And I kept my mouth shut at this time because I didn't want to get in trouble. But my thought was, no. What is the primary purpose of a doctor? It is to heal the patient. If this electric stethoscope allows you to gives you a better ability to heal the patient, then this is a better tool for the doctor to be used. I mean, you might not have this personal encounter with the doctor by coming in and touching your chest and whatever and hearing you, but that's not what makes a doctor good, right? These phenomenologists will all of a sudden prioritize the encounter above the very purpose of the doctor, which is not to encounter the person. The purpose of the doctor is to heal the sick. And this emphasis of encounter over the nature of things is something we begin to see from some of these modern priests applying to the sacraments and the liturgy. Again, now this doesn't make the priest necessarily bad or evil or defective, but I would say some of these things can have, they might be very holy and pious people, but it's not always the most clear understanding of the faith and it's not going to allow them to use the sacraments to their full. So the traditional Mass, the way it was designed by, you look at the spiritual theology. With the spiritual theology, what aspects of the liturgy will allow us to become the most holy? How can we create this liturgy that will allow us to grow in holiness the most? And that's why you have things such as Gregorian chant. We don't like Gregorian chant because it makes me feel good. Oh, I have this encounter when I have Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant psychologically is one of the best types of music for entering into prayer and meditation. It's actually the music that was used in the Jewish temple. But that's the origins of it. The theologians have talked about it. St. Augustine almost completely banned music from the liturgy. Why? Because it was distracting him. He found chant. He realized, oh, this was closer to praying than the music. I'm now focusing on prayer. I like this music because it's prayerful. Same with art. Art, yes, there's an experience, there's an encounter. The experience encounter we have with music and art are good things. We don't want to say those are bad things. But the encounter and experience is not as important as the effects it has on us. When we pray, when we go to Mass and we see the beautiful art, it should move us to prayer. It should move us toward devotion, right? If in theory, it could have no encounter, it could no special experience with it, but it's still moving you toward holiness. That is what matters. It's still teaching you the faith. That's what's important. Let's take the sacraments. So I once heard this priest talking about how confession, it's an encounter with our Lord. And I think there's something true about that. We don't want to say it's completely false, but to emphasize that as the main point of confession, to define confession as an encounter with our Lord is wrong and false. It's primarily this opportunity for our Lord to come to you and to forgive you for your sins so you can now be friends with God. You might go to confession, you don't feel anything, you don't feel a special encounter, maybe even nervous because you're speaking to the priest. Your encounter on a certain level was terrible. You were scared, you were embarrassed to say your sins. But if you did it properly, by the end, your sins were given. The primary purpose of confession is that by the end, your soul has been transformed. If you're in the state of mortal sin, you are now friends with God. You have sanctifying grace in your soul. This primary aspect of having grace in your soul, being friends with God, is infinitely more than some encounter you have, right? Again, the encounter is a good thing, but we have a disorder on what's important. Okay, now another one is marriage, and this is where phenomenologists have really gone after marriage. So the Church declares, what is the primary purpose of marriage? The primary purpose is having children and getting them to heaven. The secondary end is a mutual love of spouses. One is more important to the other. Really, the mutual love of spouses, the only purpose for that is for the good of the family, for the good of the children. Now, during Pope Pius XII, which was when the new theology was really popular, he condemned the notion that the secondary end, that mutual love is the primary end, or that the two ends are equal, and affirmed that having children and affirming and instilling them the faith is a primary end, and mutual love is secondary. But when it's all about encounter, when it's all about experience, and this is where some people have taken the theology of the body and abused it and claimed it says things that are not actually in there. I've read almost all the text, and John Paul II does not claim this. But they talk about how a common one, and this is even from a Catholic university relatively near, that's known to be very conservative, but because they have some tendencies in new theology in this area, they have taught the faith to the contrary. And that they've taught this idea that The primary end of marriage is this experience of the two, this mutual love of spouses. They emphasize the encounter and the experience. You might have a terrible marriage at the end of the day. You might marry someone and horrible things happen to them, but ultimately what matters and what makes your marriage good in the eyes of God is not the encounter, is not the experience. It's how well you did at fulfilling the ends, which is raising your children and instilling them in the Catholic faith. There's also obligations toward your spouse, but raising children and instilling them in Catholic faith, that is the ultimate purpose. But when we look at these, the new theology, there's been a tendency to distort that. So another example, I was once, when I was at Dayton, a friend invited me to a talk. They were giving some talk on theology of the body. He was a seminarian and he was giving a talk. He was an ex-seminarian. And I remember the talk, and we didn't really learn anything. There is one part where they showed these pictures of these are women when they get engaged, and look at the expression on their face. Look at how happy they are. Again, it's the encounter and the experience. But what does this have to do with like theology? What does this have to do with us living a good and healthy marriage? At one point in the talk, he was talking about body and soul, and he wasn't really sure what was a matter and form, which is a very fundamental thing in Thomism. Thomism is all about matter and form. Most people, if you just say matter and form, you could probably guess that the body is probably the matter, material, and the soul is probably the form. But he didn't know this stuff, and he gave like an hour talk on theology of the body, and there was no essence, there was nothing truly important about morality that we learned from this talk. Doesn't mean that theology of the body is bad, but the way he was taught to talk about theology and talk about these moral issues wasn't based on Thomism, wasn't based on finding the inner truth of things. It was just based on this experience that you generate. And at the end, I had no idea really what the purpose of his talk is. Okay, so when we look at how this experience thing really affects the liturgy. So once you're all about experience and encounter, that's what you're looking at. So when you look at the liturgy, as I said before, you should be looking at the science of growing in holiness, ascetical theology, and use that to develop the liturgy, all the customs and practices you have. It's about how is this going to make people holy. Now, there's some legitimate concern for, okay, if people are Polish, maybe they like some Polish saints, they like Polish Baroque, they have their Polish music they like. There's nothing wrong with that, having some moderation. But there's certain types of music that are absolutely inappropriate because these styles of music don't aid one in the spiritual growth. They don't aid one in contemplating truth. They're simply going to be distracting. But when your concern is encounter and experience, then the music is, oh, what do people like? How do they feel when they encounter this music? And you see a church who has all this music that's terrible and has nothing to do with really the spiritual life, but we put it in there because people like it. They feel so good when they hear it. They have this good encounter. Same with art. Instead of the classical, timeless art, you have these bizarre looking churches that are put in there not because they lead one to prayer. The Gothic architecture, it's kind of upward facing, this idea it lifts man's mind upward toward heaven. So there's a reason for the different classical architectures of the church. But some of this modern stuff, the modern architecture, it was just trendy and people liked it because maybe it was popular at the time. And they liked being in it, the encounter was good to be encountering a church that was trendy and whatnot. But what did that have to do with the faith? How did that help people grow in holiness?
Yeah, I just got a comment from a personal story for you. I was a rock and roll musician for years. Loved rock and roll, Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, all of it. So about 20 years ago, I walk into Immaculate Conception down there on East 40th, and I walk up to the choir loft and we sing Renaissance Polyphony, right? I think it was Palestrina or Ware or some of the Spanish guys. That was the most amazing encounter and experience I ever had as a musician.
Huh.
I said, this blows rock and roll into the weeds. I love this stuff. I've been doing the Tridentine Mass for 20 years based on encounter and experience. I just want to throw that out for you.
So I want to add, encounter experience are not bad things. They are good things. And you're an exception though. There are some people who love rock and roll and they don't like the classical music, right? And if we have those people, need to ask, okay, I love rock and roll, but at the Mass, what's going to be the best for my soul? And even though I personally I think I encounter some experience with worship or rock and roll or whatever, I know that the way my intellect works as a human being, the Gregorian chant is good for me.
It's
and as
groovy.
Pope Benedict says,
But I thought, man, I love this stuff. It's groovy. I loved it. I'm just saying, my personal journey, that's all.
yeah, and that's great, that's great. And other people have a similar story. Okay, so in a new theology, you had also, what we're talking about now is kind of more of the lower level of the new theology. So you kind of have the big academics that are teaching things. If it gets down to liturgy and stuff, that's more lower level, the average priest, whatnot, that's been taught these things and trying to practically apply it into their church, into their parish. And that's why you can see a lot of these problems you do nowadays. But I want you to be aware that the new theology, this movement, wasn't just a low-level movement. It was very much in the higher spheres. So you had great people in the Dominican order, very intelligent people in the church that were promoting these new teachings. And sadly, even at times claimed a lot of popularity. One of them was, I believe it was Henry de Lubac, Dominican. And he had this notion where he tried to lay the foundation for a universal salvation or making other religions good. And this had to do with a slight change in understanding the end of something or purpose. So the traditional teaching is that, and this is, right now I'm explaining this to show that what they would do is they would take things that weren't fully a dogma, but had always been taught the same way, and they're saying, oh, we can change something fundamental there. That changes many other aspects of the faith. So the church has long held that, but not dogmatically, that man has a natural end and a supernatural end. So what does that mean? So man has a natural end to happiness, but man does not have a natural end to heaven. So to get to heaven, God, through his generosity, makes an exception and elevates man far beyond what his nature ever entailed. So what exactly does this mean? Let's go over natural and supernatural. Supernatural just means beyond your nature. It is natural for a bird to fly. It is not natural for a dog to fly. If a dog is flying, it is acting beyond its nature. For, God intervening, a dog can have the power to fly, but it would be a miracle. It would be beyond the nature of the dog. What we talk about when we say heaven is not always understood. We tend to think of heaven as this place we go to, and it's perfect, we're really happy, it's wonderful. And though that's true, that is not the main element of heaven. The main element of heaven is the capacity to dwell and comprehend the most beautiful thing in existence, the essence of God. The human intellect is not capable of comprehending the essence of God. So heaven is when the intellect is supernaturally elevated and man can begin to comprehend the essence of God. Yes.
Is that why we can't see God?
Yes. Because God's not a material being. We can see Jesus, but the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's just the human intellect just can't do it. It's not capable of it. Exactly. But so because man is destined for a natural end, right? he has a certain natural contemplation of God just through reason, but he's not owed heaven by his nature. So what does this mean? So in terms of reaching salvation, a man kind of through the natural law can develop some sort of religion based off of reason, but that natural religion is not capable of meriting heaven. We see all these religions kind of pop up, and maybe some of them aren't even good on a natural level. So like before, really the times of Moses, there was no liturgy for the people of God or anyone. It was just kind of following the natural law and worshiping God with the natural law in your hearts. Okay? But that law did not lead you to heaven. Jesus still did die on the cross to redeem you and bring you to heaven. In order to get to heaven, Jesus died on the cross. We receive grace, and that grace is that supernatural element that allows us to be sanctified and get to heaven, have that supernatural elevation of the intellect where we can comprehend God. Now, if we say that man has a natural end to heaven, not just a supernatural end, then for God to not allow man to get there on his own accord is a bit unjust because it's part of his nature. He's made to be that way. So if man has a natural end to heaven, that means his nature is moving him there, which means that these religions that are popping up all over the place are kind of different manifestations of the true religion. Maybe they're lacking certain qualities, but they are in a true sense good and wholesome religions. They're just maybe lacking some sort of fullness of revelation that we possess. Rather, we as Catholics have to believe that that is not the case, that though they may be somehow worshiping God to the best of their abilities, in the case of your New Guinea, you have no access to the church, they can still be saved through ignorance. They are not going to be saved by their religion. They are going to be saved in spite of it, and through somehow some ignorant membership into the church that they're saved. It is not through these false religions that are saved. People like Karl Rahner had this idea of the anonymous Christian, this idea that everyone is somehow united to Christ and somehow everyone is part of Christ. And a lot of these people, these pagans, are actually just anonymous Christians, but they're ignorant. And the New Theology was really indirectly pushing this idea that all are saved. Hans Urs von Balthasar was a famous theologian, and he promoted the idea, we can have reasonable hope that all are saved. The church has declared a heresy to say everyone's saved. It's called the heresy of universalism. Origin way back in the early church started it, and it was condemned way back then. And what Balthasar tried to do, and he was certainly a new theologian, part of the New Theology, though he's considered more conservative, but I think that's being very generous. But he tried to push this idea, we can't say all are saved, so we can hope all are saved. You can't hope for an impossibility, right? So it's really an absurd thing. It's just trying to find these loopholes. It's worth noting that Balthasar also published a book on Catholicism and tarot cards, which is part of the occult. So I really don't consider Balthasar to be a noble, holy person that was just after the truth. He certainly was heavily misguided in certain ways, writing books on Catholic spirituality and the occult. All right, are there any questions? Yes.
Are there any contemporary or 20th or 21st century theologians who are pure Thomists and don't have any taint of new theology?
Well, I would say for sure.
Can you name one or two of them?
Well, are there really any major like Father Garrigou-Lagrange, he was like one of the great theologians. There are some good people with doctorates, but I don't know if we have really any great theologians. Father Thomas Crean, Dominican, very good, excellent. He's very much anti-new theology. I would say he would be a good one.
Because you said even Popes Benedict XVI and John Paul II, and even Fulton Sheen.
Yeah, so
new theology.
Look, I love Fulton Sheen, and I think there is a thing too where you have these new ideas and like, okay, maybe this will work. And hindsight is 2020, right? If there's new ideas, we can like, reach these people in a special way. Maybe this will work, and they implement it and it failed. So Teilhard de Chardin, in one of his books, Fulton Sheen is encouraging and promoting Teilhard de Chardin. This guy was in favor of a new religion. He was pro-eugenics. He was pro all these things that were completely contrary to the Catholic faith. I think Fulton Sheen is a great and holy man. I think he made a mistake. I don't think he really knew Teilhard de Chardin that well. He maybe read one of his books and promoted him. But you can see that this new idea was in the thing. And we don't want to like look at, oh, they're new theology. They're all evil. They're all bad. We want to be careful with that. We don't want to do that. But I do think there's something kind of fundamentally flawed with some of the foundations for the new theology. And I think a lot of the problems we have nowadays in doctrine and liturgy is because this new theology has changed the church in many ways. Even some of these priests that are maybe good, they're holy people, but I think at times because of their influence from the new theology, it's prevented them from having the effect they could have had. Because they maybe don't understand maybe certain things like spirituality and liturgy and the sacraments as well as they could have.
What's the name of that fellow you said, Father Thomas Crean? How do you
Father
spell it?
Thomas Crean. He has some YouTube videos. Thomas Crean. And he has an English accent, so he sounds extra smart. Any other questions?
So this new theology started in the 1920s in France.
Well,
right?
I don't know. I don't want to give the exact date, but I would say 20s, 30s.
Okay.
Because, yeah, so they never called themselves the New Theology. Father Garrigou, who was frustrated, saw this movement of people and coined you're the New Theology.
Yeah.
This is leading us back to modernism. Stop it. And he was intellectually fighting it and trying to be, these are the problems with this thinking. This is where it's leading us.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's not precise. And so some of the people in New Theology, there's not a really precise answer for exactly who is that, because kind of variations of that. And like I said, there's some like really hard lines that were going crazy. There's some very moderate that weren't, they're good people. You can probably read their writings and you'll be fine. But I personally don't read any of that. I like the traditional writings. I think it's more clear and easier to understand. But that answers your question.
Got a gentleman right there.
Cool.
I know ecumenism has been a big topic, especially with the new theology.
Uh-huh.
What do you think a true ecumenism looks like?
So actually, Father Thomas Crean writes a really good argument on ecumenism, and I like Father Thomas Crean because he's not like a crazy traditionalist, but he tries to take the traditional teaching and with great precision explain it in a healthy and academic way, not just angry. So he brings up a lot of ecumenism I don't think is legitimate at all. The one, because you have actually documents from old, not that old, but relatively recent teachings. We cannot be praying and worshiping with Catholic. If you read the old moral theology manuals, worshiping with non-Catholics is a sin. Now, what exactly does this mean? So, to go to like a Methodist liturgy, that is a sin. To participate in their worship. Now, let's say a Methodist friend dies and you want to go to their funeral. You can go to their funeral liturgy thing as long as you do not participate in their prayers. Now, the problem with worshiping with non-Catholics is that it's a manifestation of their false beliefs and false decrees. So you can't do that. Now, where Thomas Crean says it might be possible, let's say there was this meeting where it's like all Christians get together and we're just going to pray the Our Father. Because all of them are getting together, the Our Father is not a liturgy that's reflective of a particular heretical view. It's just we're all getting together because we believe in Jesus and we're praying the Our Father. There does not seem to be anything wrong with that in and of itself. I think the same, like you're going to say grace before meals, and you have your Protestant, family, and you're all saying, bless us, Lord, for these thy gifts. There doesn't appear to be anything wrong with that either. But what becomes a problem is where you have these things where Protestants and Catholics get together and honor is giving to the false religions. That really is a problem. We have to see other religions as evil and distortions of the truth, leading people toward hell, even Protestantism. Now, of course, maybe some Protestants are invincibly ignorant. We can't judge the individual, but we as Catholics know that that is the case with that religion, and we can't be participating in these other religions at all, to answer your question. I think it depends on, so I don't know if a clear definition of ecumenism has ever actually been defined. And if Rome has defined it, it'll be probably more phrased as working with non-Catholics to help bring them to the faith. So if you can bring non-Catholics here to get them to pray our Mass and stuff, that's actually promoted or permitted and good. We just can't go there and pray with them at one of their liturgies. So they have these things where they have like non-Catholics worship with Catholics at like the Mass and stuff. Are you familiar with this? I think they had the Lutherans do it at some point or something.
No.
I think Rome or some cardinals. I don't remember the whole nuances of this, but we'd have to look more closely at how it's being done. But if we're going to like the Lutheran cathedral to do that, well, I guess if we as Catholics go to the Lutheran cathedral that used to be a Catholic cathedral and we say a Mass there, I suppose we could do that. But we can't like concelebrate with the Lutherans. That's completely forbidden because they're not even valid priests, but they're also, their whole liturgy is heretical. All right, any other questions? All right, very good.
Thank you.